Oh, okay.
Yeah.
There it is. Oh.
This is Andrea's first year in the sociology department at UConn. I met her when she came to a meeting of the Coventry Book Club. And when I discovered that she had written this.
Excuse me, but I can't hear you, Gwen. There's a lot of talking going on over the other side of the room.
I'll start over again, Chris. This is Andrea's first year at the in the sociology department at UConn, and I met her when she came to a meeting of the Coventry Book Club. And when I discovered that she had recently written this book, I knew that I wasn't the only one who would be very interested in finding out a lot more about this interesting and timely topic. So I asked Andrea to speak at CLIR, and she very kindly accepted and fit us into her busy schedule. You're still commuting from New York? Her family is still in New York, so thank you very much for coming, Andrea. And you might have noticed this, CLIR now has a, what is the name of the thing? Is that an iPad? Or,
Yes.
I'm not technologically, I'm the secretary of CLIR. I don't deal with the other parts. Steve takes care of those. This will be the first attempt, let's put it that way, to film this CLIR class. So Andrea, you will be famous. Thank you.
No, thank you. And thank you all. Let me know if I'm not loud enough. I don't generally use a mic, and I teach in fairly big lecture halls, so I feel okay about my ability to project. But if it's not loud enough, let me know, and I'll either speak louder or we'll get a microphone. And thank you guys for having me. One of the things about writing a book is, especially when you're doing research, this was my dissertation project. This really is a culmination of many, many years of work. And it's one of those things where you finally get it out the door. For a while, you never want to see it again, or at least that was my experience. It was so done. And all of every now and then someone surprises me with a critique, but you know it so well, you know every problem, you're just like ready to move on to the next thing. But then this great thing happens, which is that people start encountering it, and you get to return to it. Not as the person who's been in the midst of writing it for the last umpteen years, but instead as the person who wrote it and can reflect on it as an imperfect thing that does some things and doesn't do other things, etc. So I'm gonna today give you a kind of walk you through what I talked about in this book, and happy to take questions, comments about any aspect of that, and from what's happening in the town of Lewiston to the whole process of getting it published, to what I learned and what I'm doing differently now, or what I'm repeating, etc. So feel free to come at me with questions. Strangers and Neighbors is the story of Somali settlement in what we call, in the world of the sociology of immigration, a new destination. That's the town of Lewiston, Maine. Lewiston is, anyone been to Lewiston? A few people, great. Lewiston's a former mill town of about 37,000 people. It's about 45 minutes from Portland, Maine. And despite that close distance, Lewiston's considered to be a different part of Maine. The town is known as the center of the Maine interior, really. Lewiston's a historically white community, and when I was doing this research, I went back over all of the censuses of the United States, and there were never more than 200 African Americans or black listed in Lewiston over the history of the census. Very little what we would call racial diversity, but anyone who's been to Lewiston know what kind of diversity there is there in Lewiston?
French.
French, exactly. And in fact, my family is I'm not from Lewiston, I grew up in Portland, Maine, or Peaks Island, right off the coast of Portland, but my grandmother grew up in Lewiston. And French was her first language and her language she was most comfortable in. Beginning in about the 1860s, Lewiston was a home settlement for many, many French Canadians who came to the Northeast to staff the mills of the industrializing United States. Lewiston, along with Salem, Massachusetts, and a couple of other cities, developed a very, very large French Canadian community. And that community, while not fitting into our typical understandings of diversity that we recognize and count, etc., had a challenging history in the city. A history of discrimination, segregation. French Canadian residents of the city tended to take the lower status, lower paying manual jobs in the mills, lived in a segregated part of town. And generally, I came up with a couple of studies in my literature review where people talked about the low status of the French Canadians of Lewiston. Generally, however, by the time my story begins in the early to mid first decade of the 2000s, French Canadians had largely made it into the mainstream of the community, right? Not living in a segregated neighborhood. We don't see the same economic disparity between non-French Canadian residents of the town and French Canadian residents of the town. But still, French Canadian culture and heritage is very strong there. And in the 2000 census, which was the census right before my story begins, still a great many Lewiston residents spoke French at home. And I'm trying to, for some reason, my notes won't let me scroll. So I'm going to say, I think it's 93%, but I can't get to my notes. So after I'm done, I can exit out of the presentation and actually get the exact number for you. 93% of households spoke French at home. And literally, if you just, in Lewiston, there's the Tim Hortons, which is this French chain. And if you go there, the people are speaking French at the counter. So very much this ethnic identity of the city as a French Canadian city. So, in the early 2000s, Somali immigrants began settling in Lewiston, Maine. No significant history of immigrant settlement. The city had a declining population really since the 50s, and certainly since the mills began closing in the 80s. Right? The Somali settlement in Lewiston, and I'm going to just anticipate this question. I could save it for later and spend a lot of time answering it, which is one thing to do if I'm giving a job talk. I don't answer this question up front because I want to take up that time later. But you guys, I want to just, let's get to the meat of it. So there was no explicit refugee resettlement going on the part of any agencies in Lewiston. So this is what we call a secondary migration. These were all folks who'd been brought over to the US and had been settled explicitly in other places. So the first Somalis settling in Lewiston primarily were coming from just outside of Atlanta in the areas of Clarkson and Stone Mountain, Georgia. So when refugees come to the US, they're provided special services and they're paired with refugee resettlement organizations that are supposed to assist them in terms of becoming settled in the US. But they're still free to move. But what happens then when they move, they give up those services. And so this is actually what happened in Lewiston. There was no role that the city played in, or city agencies, or Catholic charities, or any kind of organizations that usually play a role in refugee resettlement. Nothing like that happened there. This was actually a self-organized migration of Somalis who are already elsewhere in the US to the town of Lewiston. So here's the question, why? Right? Why do you have a
That's
bunch
cold.
of
Compared to
North
Somalia.
African Muslims who had been in Georgia, San Diego, Columbus, Ohio, and Minneapolis, Minnesota, moving to the town of Lewiston, Maine? Well, there are lots of stories, and actually, this is one of these really interesting things about the internet and loosely organized groups and networks of people. So based on my research, I conclude the precipitating event is that Portland, Maine, as I mentioned, not so far from Lewiston, is a big refugee resettlement town. And there was a point when some Somali immigrants were brought into Portland, and Catholic Charities in Portland did not have enough temporary housing. So they temporarily put those folks in Lewiston. So that is what we think got the word out there that there's this town of Lewiston. But there's a lot more to it than that. Because of Lewiston's declining population, there are actually abundantly available apartments, larger apartments. Somali families tend to be pretty big, and so there's an availability of larger apartments. And those apartments were in Lewiston close to the town center, so that provided access to the city as opposed to being in an outlying area where it's harder to get around. Lewiston schools are very good schools, and again, not overcrowded. The city had a very low crime rate. And so all of these factors played into, when you talk to Somalis, especially some of the first Somalis arriving, played into their decision to choose this town. But there's another really interesting part of this, is this piece about race. Because many Somalis, especially those that first came, the folks who were coming up from Georgia, were being settled in areas with a lot of African Americans. And they reported having a lot of tension because they were Muslim and their African American neighbors were not Muslim and maybe sometimes Baptist, so there was some intolerance there. There was also a desire among the Somalis to maintain their distinctiveness as Somalis. And so this aspect of Somali settlement in Lewiston is actually echoed in the way that Somalis have been settling across the U.S. So the hot spots, like the primary areas where Somalis are settling in the U.S. tend to be areas without a lot of African Americans. And I have in my interviews, and other folks who've been doing studies on Somali settlement in the U.S. have found that people explicitly say, I want my kids to be Somali, I don't want them to become African American, I don't want them to become black. They want this quest for this kind of cultural distinctiveness that was easier to achieve in a place where race doesn't, in the way that we think of it, isn't really at play. So that's a really interesting part of this research. So what happened with Somali settlement was, again, not organized by the city in any way. A few people came within a year of the city first noticing that Somalis were settling. There were more than 2,000 Somalis living in Lewiston. Again, town of 37,000. And this, and people I interviewed in the city refer to this as a crisis. And there,
Somalis or the natives of
the people who work in the city who I talked to refer to this time as a crisis because there were lots of reasons. Some of it is people just not liking the way that things were changing. But some of it is real practical, like the city school system not really having any need for English language instruction, special services for English language learners, and within the same budget year, going from having 5 students who required those services to more than 200. Right? So this was a procedural shock also for the city. And I actually had the opportunity to sit down with someone who basically became the city's default immigration services provider, because they had no such programs, because she was the social welfare services provider, and so that was handed to her as the thing to deal with while the city tried to figure everything out. So it was, as this Somali population was growing, it became a very big challenge to the city in many ways. And in my book I talk about some of the ways in which the city tried to deal with this challenge. There were, in the face of the rising tensions, actually, a group of social service providers from Portland, immigrant services providers, tried to hold a meeting in the community to talk about Somali settlement, to explain about Somali culture, Islam, etc., to kind of head off some of the negativity and rumors that had been rising in the community. And in my book I talk about how that actually ended up being a little bit of a failure in the eyes of pretty much everyone. That basically on the part of Lewiston residents who were not Somali confirmed their feeling that Somalis were just showing up and requiring all these special services that there was no money budgeted for, and nobody was there to help. Again, remember that those services of refugee resettlement that those folks would have been getting if they hadn't moved to Lewiston, they don't have those, right? So none of that refugee resettlement money is coming into Lewiston to deal with any special services that are required. And for many of the Somalis who heard about this meeting and some who attended, they felt this negativity that, oh, no one likes us here, no one wants us here. Right? So it was a kind of tense situation. And then, that was in the spring, and then in October of 2002, the mayor of Lewiston decided that he would deal with this situation by publishing an open letter to the Somali residents of Lewiston, or Lewiston Somali community, as he put it. And basically, in that letter, he said, we're full, we're done, we are maxed out, right? The Somali community must exercise some discipline and reduce the stress on our limited finances and our generosity. Our city is maxed out financially, physically, and emotionally. And what he asked specifically for in that letter is, he says, please tell your friends and family who aren't here yet, do not come. Do not come. So, what do you think happens? What happens is exactly what you might expect. The mayor published this in the local papers. Very quickly, the national news, the international news, just picking this story up. This is actually when I found out about this, because I was just starting grad school and just reading my local hometown paper, and I found out about what was going on. I was happy that I clearly found my dissertation topic, but other than that, I felt a lot of the feeling that the mayor reported. I actually met with the city administrator shortly after this, and he said that the mayor received thousands of emails and letters. How dare you, tell them they can't come, etc. Right? This very strong visceral reaction, which culminated in two things. A white supremacist group called World Church of the Creator, and actually it is now renamed the Creativity Movement. They announced that they're based out of Peoria, Illinois, but they announced that they were in full support of this letter, and that they were going to come to Lewiston to hold a rally, and this is their announcement from their website. The fastest growing white racist and anti-Semitic organization in America. That's their own self-description. Wow. The World Church of the Creator will be meeting from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. at the Multipurpose Center in Lewiston, Maine on Saturday, January 11th, 2003, and they said they chose the 11th to echo September 11th. in an effort to unite the white people of Lewiston against the Somali invasion of that city. Once that was announced, another group that had been arising in Lewiston called the Many in One organization, which was primarily an interfaith group, announced that they would hold a counter rally, a diversity rally, at the same time at another location in town. And so there was a lot of build-up to this event. So the letter was published in October, the rallies happened in January, and over that few months it was truly chaos. And it's really interesting because one of the things I discuss in my book is the way that at first Somalis were the crisis, but now this was the crisis. And when I met with the chief of police, he just explained that from October to January, he basically did nothing but plan for this day, because he didn't want there to be any violence. He needed to make sure this came off, that everything that everybody's rights were protected, that everybody was safe. In fact, the day came off pretty well. It was bitterly cold. In that day in Lewiston, they mounted the largest contingent of law enforcement in state history. And I mean, they literally had snipers on the roofs of some buildings. And approximately a few hundred people attended the World Church of the Creator rally, and a few thousand people attended the Many in One rally, which was held over at Bates College, which is in Lewiston. And there'd been media coverage of what was going on in Lewiston up to that day. And then the day ended, nothing remarkable had happened, so all the reporters went home. And here you have this community that had changed so dramatically in terms of its residents, been through this huge crisis, very not Maine-like to be in the spotlight like this, right? And all of a sudden, everyone goes home and they've got to figure out, how do we do this, right? How do we be a community that's unproblematically diverse? And this is really what I look at in my book, and so it's what I want to focus on with you guys a little bit today. How do we have these dramatic moments where we have maybe some scripts that we perform, and I'll talk about that a little bit. But generally, the question that interests me is, how do you create community in the face of diversity? And that's what I looked at in this project. It's actually what I'm looking at in my current research as well. Now, really quickly, because you guys don't care so much about what sociologists are doing about this, but usually in sociology, when we study immigrants, we study immigrant groups, right? So there'll be a study of some particular immigrant group and their experiences as an immigrant, and how they came, why they came, where they settled, etc. And it's a focus on that group. And I wanted to do something a little bit different. And maybe it's because I grew up in Maine, and I always thought Maine was really interesting to think about these issues of like race and diversity, because it's just a different landscape than many other places in the United States when you think about these issues. So there is a little bit of work out there that thinks about, well, how do we think about immigration and community change from the perspective of community, how you do community. Some of that research is called New Destinations research, which is just looking at the fact that Lewiston is not exceptional. Immigrants are not just settling in New York and Boston, right? They're increasingly, we have immigrants settling all over the place. And so when we see immigrants settling in places that aren't typically conceived of as places with long-standing immigrant settlement, we think of those places as new destinations. There's some benefits and some value, or some drawbacks in the way we think we think in terms of how it works in new destinations. And some of that stuff I've already alluded to in Lewiston. In Lewiston, there's this kind of freedom for Somalis to come in and establish a Somali identity that didn't have to fit into some existing landscape. At the same time, there are no services, right? So that's kind of the drawbacks. People think about the context of reception, which is basically what's the landscape in which newcomers are arriving. Is it a hostile context? Is it a welcoming context, etc.? But generally, even that work, thinking about that, doesn't look at like what happens on the ground in communities. And so that's what I wanted to do. And last little academic bit is I also think that something that I really wanted to do, especially in that main context, is not take any categories as given. In the US, we kind of have these set categories where we say, oh, Asian American, African American, etc. And we just assume that those categories actually match people's identities, their communities, etc. And just because of the nature of the French Canadian community in Lewiston, and me knowing that that's so significant, even though it doesn't even register on our general national idea of what are the relevant racial and ethnic categories, I wanted to take a more constructionist approach. And so I'm using the idea of symbolic constructionism, in which what I do in my research is I look at the meaning of ethnic categories, and I don't attach the meaning of those categories to a firm belief that that meaning relates to fundamental differences between the people that are designated by the different categories. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Yeah, right? So it's the category itself is what I want to look at. I'm not making an assumption that that category is really describing the people in the category, right? It's the meaning that it takes out in the public sphere. And so then what I'm doing is I'm looking at those processes by which people are producing and maintaining boundaries, cultural categories, group boundaries in the process, and the way that the creating of those categories produces inclusion of Somalis in Lewiston or doesn't. Okay? I'm going to skip this next one. Okay, so how do I do that? So basically I have a few ways in which I look at this in Lewiston. And I argue that one of the things that's going on in Lewiston is there's a need to construct a definition of community that can be inclusive of Somalis. Now, I'm new around here. I have a little place in Coventry. I'm only here a part week. Haven't gotten a chance to meet a lot of people, so I don't know how it is here. But in Maine, we have this way of speaking of our belonging by generations. I don't know if that happens around here, but yeah. I'm 4th generation Lewiston resident. Right? My great-great-grandfather came here in such and such a year. How can these people from away come and tell me what it is to be belonging here? I've been here, my people have been here for 200 years, right? So that is one way of constructing your understanding of community and membership and the ability to lay claim to membership. And in Lewiston, that has been a very common way to do that. So if you're going to construct the idea of an inclusive community in the face of Somali newcomers, one of the first things that has to happen is there has to be recognition that this old way of making sense of your ability to claim membership isn't going to work. And so one of the things that I observed was a very explicit effort on the part of people in Lewiston to define the community in such a way that Somalis could be a part of it. And this is just a quote from that rally, that Many in One rally that I told you about, where John Jenkins, who is a Lewiston community resident, he's originally from New Jersey, he went to Bates, and he stayed around, and he actually, African American, and he is, has run to be the mayor many times, has not been elected, but he has represented Lewiston in state government. And he's the second African-American actually in the state to hold that position. So in the rally, he stood up and he said, look, I had all these people here in the room, and what we're doing is we're sending a very clear message about who we are and where we are. And I have in the book, I talk about a lot of other times where people say, well, the people of Lewiston, we're kind people, we're caring people, we know our neighbors, we look them in the eye, we'll share the shirt off our back, and that's the kind of people we are in this town. So this way to define Lewiston that makes it a community of caring people, it doesn't necessarily mean that your family's been there for generations, right? That these behavioral things that we say, oh, these are the behaviors that make you a good Lewiston resident. These are the characteristics of being a good Lewiston resident. And so I in the book I talk about there's this mobilization of a definition of community. The other thing that I talk about is there has to be a way of making sense of the Somalis that make, that is not problematic. And I mentioned that there was this idea earlier that the Somalis were this crisis, a drain on resources, maxing things out. And so in that time after the rally, what I noticed is this corrective into the people kind of correct. And this happens especially in my interviews with people who work for the city. But not just, but you know, how do you talk about Somalis as not a problem? And I have one really interesting interview very early on with a very important figure in the city, where I said, well, it's been kind of a challenge to have Somalis settling in Lewiston. He's like, oh, no, not at all. It's been wonderful. It's been absolutely amazing. And this is, you know, just a few months after the rally, so it was, okay, tell me more. Well, you know, it's been great for our community. We've got all this diversity. When we're bidding for these big Walmart distribution center, we can say we have a diverse workforce. They like that. So what I noted was this rise of a way of talking about diversity that shifts away from any kind of cultural difficulties that had been arising, shifts away from claims that Somalis were draining resources to actually thinking of Somalis as a resource. They bring economic development, they're enriching the culture of town, and they're also creating this cosmopolitanism and really putting Lewiston on the map. People gave examples of folks that wanted to come and speak in Lewiston as a result of knowing about the town and its diversity. And I noted that, so in that new vocabulary that people are starting to mobilize, in which Somalis are great to have around, there's still a downside. There's still a problematic people. Well, sometimes I had to push it a little. So I would say, Somalis are great for Lewiston, but what about all this trouble that you just went through? What was that about? How do we make sense of that? And so generally in that case, in terms of making sense of the trouble, people tended to allude to particular problematic people. And those problematic people were usually folks who were kind of not back to this idea of making sense of redefining Lewiston. Those problematic people were not really part of Lewiston. So for example, when I met with the chief of police, he's like, you know, the troublemakers in Lewiston don't even live in Lewiston. Right? I had all of these activists wanting to come up from Boston and tell us what to do. I have all of these other people who see there's an issue here and they've got an axe to grind and they want to come and do it here. Right? We don't have the problem here. So this outsiders exploiting the city. And then I'd have some people say, look, you know, every town's got some of their bad apples, you know, people who are going to make their racist comments and whatever, but that's not us. And I don't even listen to those people. And so just here are a couple examples of that kind of talk. Well, so here on on your left is a quote from a city official who talked about diversity being good for Lewiston. And I show in my book, and this is something that some academics like to do, and I don't know if you guys are familiar at all with Foucault, but Foucault is a social theorist I really like, and he talks about the importance of rupture and what it reveals about power and culture. And in my mind, what I look at in Lewiston is exactly this period of rupture, where 2 years before Somalis started settling in Lewiston, I would not hear this. I would maintain, will not hear this in an interview. Right? A mobilizing, a new way of making sense of things, a new discourse. And so this is an example of that kind of, oh yeah, diversity is good discourse. It's good for the community, you know. Diversity brings economic development. I mean, you know, whether they be Somalis or whatever their nationality or whatever culture they are. Okay? And then, as I said, there are these problematic people. Well, those problematic people aren't really like us, and is their thinking, the thinking that emerges. And I actually talked about in the book how I really noted that othering, either through saying, well, they're not even from here, they're coming up from Boston, they're people from away. Do you guys have that expression here? Yeah, so in Maine, I grew up in an island off the coast of Maine, right? So we're just like islanders and people from away. And like, how dare they tell us? They have no claims to know anything about us. Well, you know, you see the same thing in Lewiston. But then sometimes with these racist bad apples, there's a different way of excluding them, and it was a class-based way. And so this quote, I'll have to say it for you so you hear. But this city employee that I'm interviewing, when I ask, are there problems? And she's like, yeah. You know, over the last 2 or 3 years, I'll hear things like, and then she puts on, like, totally switches up her accent. She has a slight Maine accent, but then she totally switches it up to have this really heavy Maine accent. So she, you know, you guys get paid $20,000 to move in a Somali family. Where the heck's that coming from? I don't even listen to them. So that way, that rhetorical strategy of like using the accent to be able to dismiss the concerns, right? Those people, we don't need to listen to them because that accent is an accent you're more likely to hear among lower class, less educated people. And so one of the things I talk about in the book at length is the way that this kind of, this adoption of the benefits of diversity has the problematic character. Like it's diversity is good. What's bad is people who don't like diversity. Who are those people? Those are the poor people. And one of the things I show in the book is that those folks tend to live in town next door to the Somalis. They're not provided access to all the resources that end up getting mounted in Lewiston to help people to manage life in a cross-cultural community. Okay. Let's skip over that one. Now, about those resources that help people to manage life in a cross-cultural community, one of the things about my book, something I didn't expect when I started doing this project, was this role of people from away in terms of helping the folks of Lewiston to enact an unproblematic multicultural community. What does that mean, what I just said? What it means is there are all these experts that came into Lewiston, diversity trainers, human rights, consultants, people to work from the Department of Justice to work with the city on the way that they manage diversity, people from equal opportunity coming in to make sure that Lewiston was following the rules and that people in Lewiston were doing things the right way. So I noted all of these experts coming in, And often, those experts would come in and offer diversity training, anti-racism workshops, et cetera, et cetera. And so for me, this was a really interesting thing. I happened to attend one just when I was doing field work. And the thing about it that kind of I thought was really interesting is that the trainer didn't know anything about Somalis in particular. They didn't know anything. And so it was this really interesting thing where there were people in the audience asking questions
Were
about.
there Somalis in the audience, or was it all white?
So in this particular one, and most of them, no.
No, wait.
And I taught no Somalis in the audience. And so this is in my book. I have a whole chapter where I look at this. There are a few different types of these. So some of these training sessions were what I call cultural brokerage sessions, where actually Somalis were the expert panel. And then folks would come, usually that was like service providers. So people from the hospital, people from LL Human Resources, whatever, would sit there and they would ask questions like, look, I'm having a hard time with my Somali employees coming late, what should I do? So in those cases, there would be Somalis, but they were the experts answering questions about how to deal with Somali employees. Mostly in diversity training sessions, there were no Somalis. And in general, in only one case where there was a Somali cop from LA who works as a diversity trainer for law enforcement. And that is the only time where you had that kind of inside knowledge outside of this brokering session, yes.
Who asked for this training?
Who asked for the training? So, very good question. Usually nobody asks, usually it is offered.
But why? I mean, what would be the reason that somebody thought they knew what was best for a town they don't know anything about?
Well, so let me explain what I did research-wise, because I'm glad you guys find this interesting, because it's one of my favorite things about this study. So, people were coming from all over. Seattle, there's some people from Portland, Boston, and
To
offering
deliver the training or to take
to
it?
deliver the training in this town.
And who paid for it?
So some of them were free. One of them was $300. That one was attended by me and several people from the city who were told to go there for work. Several people who worked at a local bank who were paid by Human Resources to go. Most of them were offered. Some, like these brokerage sessions, were set up by the Portland's Immigrant Services, and then the service providers came from their work. And usually for those, they weren't have to go. People that weren't told they had to go. That was a place for them to ask questions. So the thing about this is there's an entire industry of anti-racism programs and diversity training programs. And one of the things that I ended up doing as a result of this is I kind of followed these types of programs out of Lewiston, and I actually got certified as a diversity trainer at a national training seminar to find out what's the idea here, what is this? Because at first I just thought when people were coming to Lewiston and they weren't knowing anything about Somalis in particular, that maybe they're just not very good at their jobs. But over time I started to notice this happening again and again. I was like, what is going on here? So it's something I decided to follow out. The city actually hired a diversity professional who had worked in universities for decades. And they hired her to come in and to be the diversity professional for the city. Right? Again, she knew nothing about Lewiston. She hadn't even been in city government, really, or even in the region, right? But they hired her for this particular expertise. So one of the things that I noted, as I said, was that tension of having this workshop, having this expertise. There's a lot of similarity between the workshops. They focused on presenting a particular vocabulary, particular exercises, ways of talking about diversity, but there was a real gap here between the questions that people often had. And so this is just, I was in one training session that was offered by the Department of Justice to city workers. And so this was, you know, the garbage, people who pick up the garbage, other fiscal plant type issues in the city. It was not like the high level officials, it was the everyday workers of the city. And they were sitting in this, you know, work mandated training with the Department of Justice. And one of these gentlemen asked a question. He said, they just received a lecture on how you shouldn't tell racist jokes, and you have to be very respectful, and you always have to smile, and you be open to your neighbors, even if they're Somali. And so this guy, he hadn't really said anything, and the whole crowd really hadn't participated that much. And when he spoke, he had that like emotion in his voice, you know, it's like that anger bordering on pain kind of thing. And he's like, it's a two-way street. He was talking about respect for your neighbor. I have some Somalians living right next door, and I saw my Somali neighbor on the sidewalk, and I said hello, but she just ignored me. I didn't do anything for her to treat me like that, did I? What about my respect? What about being a good neighbor? Now, that moment really stuck with me because that diversity trainer could have said any number of things to maybe help in this situation, to see that pain and recognize it and say, look, it's very likely that for religious and cultural reasons, she doesn't talk to men who aren't her relatives on the street, right? It's very, it's probably not anything you did. This is probably about cultural difference, especially if she's by herself. Explain. But that didn't happen.
Are the Somalis invited to these sessions, or are any of them in attendance?
So as I said, in general, Somalis have not been in attendance at these unless they're experts as these kind of cultural brokerage sessions. But those sessions, and this is one of the things when I make that claim about class and who has the resources and the help, those sessions are for service providers who encounter Somalis, or employers who are encountering Somalis as they're in charge and the Somalis are kind of their patients or their employees. This quote that I just had up is somebody talking about their neighbor. And those sessions that they had access to aren't sessions where it was really fostering intercultural dialogue at all. Instead, these are sessions where they were getting this kind of rote, this is how you do diversity.
So what did the trainer say?
Is that what the trainer said?
No, this is part of how you do. That trainer said, well, you don't know what was going on. She might have had a bad day. She might just not be a very nice person. You can't want one person spoiling for all Somalis. It was a total missed opportunity.
Totally.
That's
Are
why we
there,
need somebody there.
corresponding programs for the Somalis?
So in my book, I talk about that Somalis actually don't have the same program. They have programs that are much more procedural. This is how to dress for the interview. This is the eye contact that people are expecting. This is the nature of expectations around being on time, or what to do when you're sick. So much more kind of procedural, and again, more working towards the world of work, not so much like how you're gonna deal with your neighbors. And so I think actually that's one of the things I talk about in the book is a little bit interesting, because for non-Somali folks, the nature of the training is kind of like this cultural re-education, like don't tell racist jokes. And for Somalis, there's actually a little more explicit awareness that like there's a cultural gap here that needs to be addressed. So I think it's interesting because this cultural gap that the Somalis are experiencing is addressed somewhat, whereas the cultural gap being experienced by the non-Somalis is kind of glossed over by this adoption of a discourse. And so this is, when I followed these diversity trainings out, what I talk about in the book is that there's this kind of fundamental theory and also what I call praxis, which is a set of behaviors in terms of how you are supposed to do diversity. And it is, people keep asking me, were any Somalis there? It's a theory and praxis that doesn't require, in fact, it goes a little bit easier for you if you don't even actually have to talk to people who are different from you, right? It's a way to signal that you're fine with that, but it's not really so much something that helps you through cultural
Practical.
difference.
It's not practical.
It's not practical cultural difference. And so it's a foundational theory and concrete skills necessary for coalition building in the face of historic divisions of race, class, gender, religion, sexual orientation, and other group identities, right? But those were things that you kind of learn in isolation from the everyday experience of face-to-face diversity without that structure of being the employer versus employee or the doctor versus patient, right? That's why I call it strangers and neighbors, right? How do you be neighbors across these gaps? So anyway, I think I'm not gonna go through all this because I run through the nature of diversity training. But one of the key things that I noted was, again, this piece about class. Because class was like the elephant in the room for a lot of my study. And even in these diversity trainings, when I went to become a certified diversity trainer, we were actually explicitly counseled in our diversity training to avoid making class visible. And so this is a quote from a diversity training leader. We've just been trained how to use this one exercise as a community building exercise. And so the way that in this, I went through 2 diversity training sessions, one corporate and one anti-racist. And this was in the corporate training session. And so what we would do in that training session is they would basically teach us the tool. We would do the tool, and then we would talk about it, and they would say, what's this tool good for, what's it not good for, how would you tweak it? And so we just finished this tool, and the tool is a community building tool where everyone had this questionnaire, favorite languages you speak, favorite vacation destination, what kind of car you drive, etc. And then you filled it out for yourself, and you're supposed to walk around the room and see if you find people you matched with on each of these things. And we were talking about it afterward, and the trainer said, well, it's probably, if you're going to use this, it's probably not a good idea to talk about what kind of car you drive, what languages you speak, or your favorite travel destination when you have upper and middle level managers in a session with folks who are working on the assembly line. And then actually there were 2 trainers, and the other trainer said, oh no, in that situation I wouldn't use this one at all. Right? You don't want to actually raise the fact that there's inequality. You don't want to make that obvious.
This is among the Americans.
Well, this is
So
in the
the
training.
assembly line workers, the American assembly line workers, there might be more hostility between the high-paid Americans and the low-paid Americans.
Right, but the idea here then is that this is a tool in terms of the idea of thinking about this diversity training and how it works. This is a tool that's actually designed to gloss over problematic difference, right? It's designed to gloss over. It's not designed to actually give you the tools to get along in the face of that difference. And so we can extend that also to thinking about, again, a community, a real face-to-face, know your neighbor community with extreme cultural difference, which is what we're seeing in Lewiston. Right? So I want to have time for general questions. So really quickly, even though I said that most people who study this kind of stuff focus on the immigrant groups and don't look at community, I didn't completely ignore the Somalis in my study. In fact, one of the things is after I build this way of looking at what's going on here, I come back and I say, so how does this structure of people kind of adopting the right language for demonstrating that they're fine with diversity, for talking about diversity in such a way that it makes sense, for defining community in such a way that you're not de facto excluding Somalis, how does all this come back to impact Somalis? And one of the things that I say is that Somalis in Lewiston encounter what I call an impersonal embrace. They're engaged as like, they're good to have around, they make us look good, we're competitive for this Walmart distribution center was a really big deal when I was there, right? We're competitive for that. But, you know, that, a lot of sociologists refer to that as kind of happy talk. Doesn't really engage like the actual nature of diverse community. But I do, just to be fair, and to make sure I raise that, one of the things I discuss in the book is that I show that the Somalis themselves, in terms of when they, at one point there's a public response on the part of Somalis, a public response to the mayor's letter. And what I show is in that letter, actually the Somalis who wrote that letter adopted a lot of that same vocabulary. Well, we're a benefit to the community, etc. Right? So there is this, that impersonalness. But the other thing I show in the book is that there's a little bit of a pressure for Somalis to be the right kind of Somalis. They've got to be the kind of Somalis who fit into this discourse as well.
Is it pressures within the Somali community or pressures perceived from outside the community on the Somali community? Which way is the pressure going?
It is the broader context in which Somali residents of Lewiston are engaged. And I show in the book, there's a lot of detail here, right? But one of the things is there's a fundamental assumption of the Somali community. That you can say the Somali community should deal with this, and that there's somehow this cohesive, organized community of people, which actually not true.
That's what I'm
Right,
saying.
so already that first assumption of engagement is problematic. And so one of the things I talk about is how there's this tremendous struggle among Somalis in Lewiston to establish who's in charge. Who's in charge of the Somali community of Lewiston? If there has to be a Somali community, you've got to figure out who's in charge of it and what that community is about. And in fact, there are two organizations that are really vying for that position. And it's not just a symbolic position, because the city, in their approach to dealing with things, actually seeks out some experts from the Somali community to advise them on matters of policy, contracts with Somali organizations to deliver welfare services, to provide grant funds for particular things. So actually, there's this position that is kind of demanded that carries significant influence in financial benefits for the organization that's recognized as the organization representing the Somali community. And so I show how there are these two organizations. One's called the African Immigrants Association, and one is called Somali Community Services. And Somali Community Services is initially the organization that the city's working with. But what ends up happening is Bates College invites a person who is from a group that is arguing for recognition of and inclusion of people who are homosexual in Islam. So as a result of this, several members of Somali Community Services protest this speaker. And they pass out a statement saying that this is contrary to their religion of Islam. And at the same time, or actually right after, the African Immigrants Association, which had just been forming, Somali Community Services was already established, they were already getting the city money to provide services, etc. And then the African Immigrants Association, in response to Somali Community Services' protest of this talk, sends out a letter where they believe in full equality. We commit ourselves to the construction of a community free of hatred among or within us, where no one must live in fear and terror, where all live freely and equally. And what's interesting, and I discuss in the book, that there have been several months of this jockeying between the two organizations, like who's really going to represent the Somali community, and this is the end of it for Somali community services. Basically, within a year, they're kind of a fringe organization. They're not getting any city money. They're considered to be too conservative, and so people aren't even really thinking about, are they representative of Somalis, like who, if there is such a way of thinking about which of these groups is representing the community or in touch with the community, that's not really the conversation anymore. One other way in which this kind of cultural framework of recognition impacts Somali residents in Lewiston is this drive to make Somali culture consumable and enjoyable for non-Somali residents of Lewiston. And so in the book I talk over several years, there's a rise of this annual Somali culture night for the city, for non-Somalis. And there's this tension about who's it really for, because in the first few years it's more of a Somali event, and there's some things about that one of those things is the food eating doesn't happen till 10 p.m. Right? So that's a huge issue the first year, because it's a Somali culture night, and then other people in the community come and they say, oh, I want to be inclusive, but I'm starving, this is so rude, right? And so there's this transition to like making it less the way that a Somali culture night would happen and more the kind of culture night that other people expect. And then over the years, it eventually ends up being called the African Heritage Night, and food and a marketplace, etc. So this rise of this consumable Somaliness is something that I show. So, I mean, just to wrap up, and I hope that I've been a little bit coherent to try to run you through the basics of my argument. But, you know, so I end up kind of being this, it's a little bit ambivalent, my book, right? I'm like, look at all the work that people are doing to be inclusive, to be a diverse community. There's a lot of great stuff that comes out of that, but it's also, there's a lot of work to be done yet, right? This is a fairly impersonal thing. In a way, it's kind of coercive of Somalis. The class piece is something that really sticks with you. It doesn't get resolved in any kind of a way. So can we say that the Somalis of Lewiston have been included in the community? And it's interesting because of course I still follow Lewiston, and I feel that they're about on a 3-year cycle in Lewiston. About every 3 years there's something happens that reignites the drama. It could be, once it was, they had a new mayor, just as I was going to press, a new mayor, and this was 10 years after that first letter. 10 years to the month. Their most recent mayor gave a BBC interview because the city does, people know it, right? So BBC was there doing the study of Somalis and settling in Maine, and the mayor said, look, if you're going to come to Lewiston, you need to check your culture at the door. And so again, instantly, like, you know, people mobilize, like, no, you can't say that, you can't say that. And the mayor finds himself at a city council meeting, standing in front of hundreds and hundreds of angry people, trying to defend his statement. And it's interesting because if you look at his statement, and I describe it in the book, he actually uses that entire vocabulary of, you know, I have many great Somali neighbors, students, great for the community, economic diversity, etc., but doesn't change his claim about culture. But one of the things that I thought was so interesting is, as I said, 10 years between these two things. This is a picture from the paper of the Many in One group, some key members of the Many in One group that responded to the first mayor's letter. They were primarily, as I said, an interfaith group. They were advocating for Somalis, but there's really no one was Somali.
Yeah.
This is the group that protested the second mayor's comment to the BC. So I see progress. And this is a quote from a Somali resident of Lewiston responding to that 2012 controversy. This is a country where we have millions of people with different political ideologies, different religious theology, but with one important sense of communal commitment that we have. And that communal commitment is far more important than anything else. So, in my mind, it kind of is a little bit of a success story, right? If you develop a definition of community that allows people to own it, I mean, it's messy, it's not uncontested, right? But there still is that opportunity for people to get in and lay claim and say, yeah, I'm part of this. And so, that ability to be included, which allows not some folks who are unquestionably included, but allows the people themselves to stand up and say, no, you don't say that about us.
So how much assimilation has there been on both sides? I mean, the assimilation of the Somalis into the community and accepting American cultures of that particular city, and vice versa.
And what's included in assimilation?
I guess, so that's why it's hard to answer that question. What do we mean by assimilation? So I guess I would put, I can give you some stats or whatever, but I guess I want to know, what do you mean when you say
Do the kids play together outside of school? Do they go to each other's houses?
Do they accept one another's cultures in any shape or form? So we were talking about the festival, and there were different eating habits. So they obviously changed that because that had to do with a fair. But were there other changes made on the part of those groups?
Right. So the kids are all in the same schools. They're all in the same sports teams.
But do they eat lunch together, or are they at separate tables?
So there is, so it's interesting because a few years ago, Lewiston's right across the river from Auburn. And a few years ago, there was actually a newspaper story about problems between Somalis and non-Somalis in Auburn. And everyone was saying, yeah, it's so much better at Lewiston High, because they know how to do it. So, once again, is it unproblematic? No. But the kids, as always, leading the way in the same school. Somali, so when you look at the numbers in terms of the Somali second generation, the Somali second generation has better numbers in terms of college, high school graduation, college attendance, level of college, than the typical population, white population. So the students themselves, Somali students tend to be very successful and do very well. So in terms of, that's what do you mean by assimilation? In sociology, we would call that structural incorporation. We see very good, in the second generation, we see great job numbers, we see high educational attainment. That first generation, the folks who are just coming, that is more challenging, but I mean, there's so much there. I mean, folks who come to the US only having ever lived in a refugee camp, never being even literate in their first language, coming over with 5, 6, 7 kids, right? So a first generation immigrant in general generally takes a hit in terms of their ability to make it in that society. That's why immigrants usually do it for their kids, right? And we do see the success of the kids. Again, but it's not unproblematic. Every now 3-year cycle. 1 year it was some kids threw a ham sandwich at the Somali kids. Right.
What are the numbers now? I think you said in 2000 it was 2,000 Somalis, 37,000 in the total town, or something like that.
So the town,
what are they now?
The town is about 38,000 now, and it's about 3,500 Somalis. So it's the Somali population is pretty stable, about 3,500. However, I went really fast. Somalis in Somalia, Somalis are migrating people, And there are many people who have settled in Lewiston and have now been there for 10, 15, 20 years, but there's also a strong contingent of folks coming and going. And in fact, one of my early interview experiences that I talk about in the book is I'm sitting down with a Somali woman and I say, so now that you're here in Lewiston, what do you think your life's gonna be like in 5 years? And she laughed at me. I'm Somali. I go where the wind takes me, basically, you know. So, and so there's been a little bit of that. Like
So there's been some outward migration?
well, the population is kind of peaked at about 3,500, but
Okay.
it's not just the same people. There are people coming and
Yeah,
going.
but that's less than 10% of the total town. I mean,
But again, there's a visibility issue.
Yeah, no,
because
no,
of
I
where
understand that,
people
but I
live
mean,
in
it's-
downtown.
there's other places that the percentages are a lot higher,
Sure.
and you've got other issues as a result of that.
Sure, but
Yeah.
it's also really, one of the interesting things about Lewiston, there are lots of other immigrant groups in Lewiston now.
Oh, okay.
Somalis kind of went, and I actually had people say that, and also lots of African Americans. And I did a focus group, and there's one African American woman who was there, and she was told by her, a social worker in Boston that she should consider Lewiston, because now Lewiston was opened up to diversity. And so, the town itself has a lot of other
Okay.
groups that have
Alright.
settled.
Good.
Andrea, I really like the way you've told your story. Having had a little bit of acquaintance with your book, as you were talking, it's like I really think you are on the cusp of something new and different in definitional in the work that you're doing that will make it much more useful to those of us who do want to make it a better world. And as I come out of health economics, you know, multiple regression, you plug in the numbers, you got the test, and the little ones, they go up and down, and then you got the answer at the end. Where it strikes me as you are is pre-computer. You're figuring out the variance, but you don't have a way to measure them the way we do in health economics. So that that's the really creative part of research. And I'll just finish by saying, I'm so glad that now you're on a tenure track, because you get to expect your kids to write something that the way you want to hear it, instead of having to read a thesis advisor for a thesis advisor who knows the way he wants to hear it.
Right, and I think that's, one of the challenges of doing this, I mentioned I grew up in Maine, I was the first person in my family to go to college. And so when I wrote this book, I really wanted it to be for people in Lewiston.
Mhm.
And the book has actually been very well received in Lewiston. And I've heard from various people that picked it up that they thought it was great. But it's just the nature of being at the point I was first sending it out to presses, being a dissertator. And I don't have that, if a reviewer comes back and says you need to talk more about theory, or, I don't have that ability to say no, because I need to get this published so I can get a job. So, I think that was one of my disappointments with this book, is handing it to my dad, and then him saying, this is a little tough to read for me.
It was tough to read for me.
Yeah, and I think, I've assigned it to my students, and what I usually do is I say, read the first 20 pages of the first chapter, skip the academic jargon, and then read the middle. But that first and that last chapter are the ones I had to put in there for the reviewers.
All right, I really have to read it now. If you've been able to escape all the sociological, academic jargon in this book,
I
will
haven't,
read it.
well,
Have to escape
skip
it.
the first, read
I'm
the
a sociology
beginning.
major, so I'm
Read the
familiar with it.
beginning, like that first, when I'm describing Lewiston, when it gets jargony, skip the rest of that first chapter, and I think the other chapters. My favorite personally is chapters 4 and 5.
Which are,
Chapter 4 is where I talk about the diversity training,
okay.
and chapter 5 is the one where I talk about the experience of Somalis.
Oh, good. I missed those.
Yeah, that's what I would recommend, but.
What's the housing like in Lewiston? Are the groups segregated by housing?
No.
That's
That's pretty pretty
Yeah, there's the
Informed
that's the
them.
thing, it has that old density, and, the Somalis, primarily, there is one housing project a little bit out of town, but generally, people are living really in the center of town, because that's where the less expensive housing is. And, that's an important part of the story.
Other than Walmart, what other employment opportunities?
LL Bean is huge, and LL Bean has developed a lot of, they were really at the forefront of figuring out how to bring Somalis into the workforce. It's, and, you know, it's only like 25 minutes to LL Bean, and they developed like, employee, transportation options, etc. So, the hospitals, there are 3 hospitals in Lewiston. I mean, Lewiston is a regional hub, so there's a lot there. The hospitals really worked hard to bring people in, and then Country Kitchen Bakery, which does, they do is it Rudy's Organic? One of the like sandwich breads. They're right, actually, the smell that you smell when you're in Kennedy Park, which is right in the center of town, is the bakery. It's right there on the park. It's like bakery, police station, city hall. So a lot of folks get started in there. Yeah.
Yes. What about white flight? Because you know the concept of the tipping point, and actually I experienced it in Willimantic at Wyndham High School. Once you get, what is it, 35% minority, white flight really begins, or there is a definite point. But you haven't reached that point in Lewiston. I mean, there's no, but can you extrapolate any of your experience to white flight and to what's happened to our cities?
Yeah, so Lewiston was already pretty empty. And one thing I talk about in the book is Lewiston, you know, in 2001, where I started getting this project going, you picked up a Maine guidebook, probably Lewiston, the second largest city in the state of Maine, isn't even in the guidebook.
It's the second one.
Second largest.
Second
30
largest after
38,000.
Portland.
Because of the mills closing.
Yeah, but also the anti-French sentiment. Yeah, oh, for sure. I talk about it in the book. Oh, for sure. Absolutely. Yeah. And so, there's the density of it. So basically where the Somalis are moving in is they're moving into a poor urban neighborhood that was already empty and struggling. And so if anything, they've revitalized it.
They helped it.
Lewiston is going through a renaissance, in large part because Somalis getting there, kind of breaking the ground for that, and then the younger generation of people, you know, people in their 40s and younger who couldn't afford to buy in Portland, who wanted a more urban experience. So, I don't know, Connecticut seems to me, with my limited experience, a little bit interesting that way, because really for the last 10 years anyway, most urban areas have seen a resurgence, because younger people are wanting, they don't want there to be in their cars. They're actually, scholars refer to it as the Great Inversion, this movement out of the suburbs back to the urban areas, and so Lewiston's been experiencing that. And Somalis really were the cutting edge of it.
And who are the ones who left at Lewiston?
Well, no one's really left in the last,
No, but,
they've been gaining population, but they've been losing it since the 50s.
yeah.
And really when the mills closed, the last mill closed in 84, and, that really, so basically there was nothing there except for the bakery, in terms of in the center of town. And so the population that was left tended to be, less educated. I mean, I talk about this in the book, but there's stats on the city in 2000, less educated than the state on average, lower income than the state on average in that downtown area. Yeah.
And, you said that there are new immigrant groups moving in. Now, are these refugee resettlement?
Again, not explicit.
No, so they don't have this.
And where are they from?
They're actually an early group to come after Somalis were folks from Togolese. There are Sudanese folks that come in. boot,
Any Asian groups?
not as an organized group. I mean, there are some Asian residents,
And is there conflict between the newer groups and the
Immigrant
Somalis?
groups.
not so much that I know of, and I think maybe part of this is the religious thing. Religion is one of the things, and I should also mention that where Somalis were settled in Georgia, there were some other Muslim immigrant groups, but they tended to be Middle Eastern or groups that we consider to be white. And so the Somalis, and there is documented kind of racial differentiation between different Muslim groups. And so Somalis, who are primarily Sunni Muslim, or majority Sunni Muslim, definitely wanted to have their own Somali Islamic centers. And so there hasn't really been much tension between immigrant groups in Lewiston, but there's still certainly, even though there are these other groups, Somalis are the primary immigrant group of the city. And Somali is an active identity that people, often will assume an immigrant is, an immigrant who's black is Somali. Yeah.
Does Governor LePage have, really, that's a serious question, and the Beans of Egypt, Maine, interact in some way with this urban environment, or are they excluded? Are they internal to the city? Do they surround the city? What is the effect of this group and that governor on what's happening?
Well, I mean, Governor LePage is not so different from Norm Macdonald, who has been the mayor of Lewiston. In fact, Macdonald predated him, LePage, by a couple of years. That's the political landscape. How does that interact with people's everyday lives in Lewiston? I mean, I guess I would say that folks generally resist the explicitly racist rhetoric. Like LePage, for example, said that he was going to create a list where he publicized who gets aid. Some of that is pretty explicitly directed against immigrant groups. Some of his rhetoric is pretty explicitly directed against immigrant groups, including the Somalis. The thing about the Somalis in Lewiston, however, is now they've been there long enough. And even Norm Macdonald, the mayor who said to the BBC, "You check your culture at the door," when he was defending himself, he made a point of commenting on what great colleges all the Somalis get into. So, it's a tension there. One of the dramas that came in this 3-year cycle is a few years ago, an Asian American was running against the mayor for that mayoral seat, and Mayor McDonald's had explicitly racist, anti-Chinese propaganda in his flyers against this guy. So it's interesting. One reason I love working in this community is this interesting mix of like a neighborliness with the most outlandish, like violating all the norms of civility that we learn in our diversity training, all happening in the same community. And one of the things I talk about is I think there's this entire ritual that they go through each time of people standing up and saying no, people saying we're not this kind of town, and then getting through with this big demonstration that repairs it for the time being.
Interesting.
In your research for your book, did you study other immigrant settlements in this country? And did any of them have a better idea, more successful at this?
So I didn't study others, but in my lit review, I read about other people's studies. Do other people have a better idea? I don't think so. Honestly, one of the things I think is special about this case, and the reason I like looking at a destination like this, is, Lewiston's a kind of place where if you pass somebody on the sidewalk, and people are out and about, it's a town, there are people walking around, not everyone's just in their car, and you pass them and you look them in the eye and you say hello. And, or, as we saw, that this is a norm that if it gets violated, people feel a little upset. So in another location, so you can imagine still being rural, but being in a part of the country where there really are these set racial groupings already. And this idea of identity and segregation that really isn't at play here in the same way that you see in other places. So, I personally like the possibility that comes from having immigrants settling in a place where they didn't already have an entire scaffolding of slotting people into their boxes and having, just a way of doing this diversity through differences that don't get, boundaries that don't get challenged. One of the things that I quoted in here, and I said there's something interesting about thinking about race in Maine, is I interviewed someone who was in his 60s, and he's like, yeah, I don't really understand what the big deal is here. In 20 years, the Somalis are just going to be married with everyone else, just like the Italians and the Irish.
Wow.
We're not going to know who's who. Right? That's totally shocking to somebody who studies race in the United States, to have a conservative white man saying this doesn't matter, we're all just going to mix together. So it's, I think, one of the interesting things about a place like this.
Say you have a neighbor that's moved in, different culture altogether. Is there any place on the internet where you can search and find out what all these social situations are in terms of basic things that, so you don't, like that one fellow just couldn't believe they didn't respond?
So there is actually an intercultural press. And there's an entire literature on intercultural relations, which is different from this anti-racist or diversity talk. Because the idea of intercultural stuff actually was developed for business people, right? They actually can't get, if you're trying to make a deal with someone, you actually got to know how to communicate and how to be effective. And so there actually is a press. So if you have a neighbor and you know where they're from, you can search for books about, intercultural relations with that particular group. And often you'll find it in the world of business, because that's the place where they've been able to. But sometimes, if it's a group, it's a really well-established group, you'll find it for that group. And what's interesting, actually, one of the things I'm doing research on now is etiquette, because that's one of the things this project really developed my interest in, because there are books about how to deal with Americans. And if you read them, and this is the kind of training Somalis were getting. If it's a woman, you should shake her hand, but you should only if she offers her hand first. Right? I didn't really notice that about us, but yes, right? The nature of eye contact. Look at someone when you're speaking to them, but you also have to look at them when they're speaking to you. Like those things that actually are really important in terms of the way that we interpret other people. And so intercultural press books are really great.
You mentioned earlier on about the Somali festival, and then something about I got in late, so the African, you talked about an African group. What does that African group consist of?
So initially, it was primarily Somalis who were settling. Within a few years, other immigrant groups, or people from other countries started settling, and some other African countries. And so, there had been this group, Somali Community Services, which was the kind of initial group. But then later, this other group formed, which was called the African Immigrants Association. It wasn't just Somalis. So most of the leadership was Somali, but then there were some other people from other countries as well. And the African Immigrants Association basically, I mentioned everyone kind of supplanted Somali Community Services as the organization that the city worked with. And the city actually started putting out money to help put on this festival. And so actually what happened was it had been called the Somali Community Festival or Somali Independence Day. It was usually in July because July is both US 4th of July, but also Somalia got their independence on July 9th, I think it is. So it was right around there. But then all of a sudden, a few years in, the name of this festival got changed to the African Immigrants Festival. And instead of just being about Somalia, there also were some folks from other countries and this big African market and food from all over. And so it was this kind of generalization. One of the things I talk about in the book, though, is that actually Somalis in Lewiston organized and kind of pushed back on that. And they actually ended up reestablishing the Somali Festival as a separate entity later. So that's what that was.
African is so diverse. I mean,
well, that's one of the things I talk about in the book, and there's this kind of generalizing of all of these different cultures, and that's Somalis in the community pushed back and said, no, Somalis is its own thing, and this is our culture. We're not doing this generalized.
Yes, I worked in Kenya. There were 46 different languages, different tribes. So the idea of Kenyans being one is that's not reality.
Yeah, and I've actually glossed over another thing, which is that actually a minority group in Somalia called the Somali Bantu, and actually that name itself is contested.
Sure.
But this is just a group of people that were considered not Somali in Somalia, and initially some Somali Bantus started settling in Lewiston, and there were a lot of tensions between Somalis and the Somali Bantu. And it's interesting, the city took a long time to figure out that there was a problem. Because their assumption was, again, this is one group. This is one group.
Thank you, Andrea.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.